Beneath the floor of Wawel Cathedral, in the old city of Krakow, there is a crypt. The crypt is not very large. The air is cool and still and faintly damp. Stone sarcophagi line the walls, heavy, darkened, centuries old. And here lies Casimir the Great, who is said to have found a kingdom built of wood and left it in stone. Here lies Władysław Jagiełło, who joined Poland and Lithuania, forging the largest state in Europe. Nearby lies Stefan Batory, the warrior king from Transylvania. And in a coffin of black marble lies Jan III Sobieski, who broke the Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683 and saved the Habsburg Empire from destruction. 500 years of Polish kings were crowned and buried in this place. Their coats of arms still hang from the walls. Their swords still rest on velvet cushions, and Polish flags fly proudly from the castle above them. But between 1795 and 1918, for 123 years, the once powerful country they ruled did not exist. This is the story of how that happened. Not how a country was conquered, but how a country came apart. How a land that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the edge of the Black Sea steppe, home to Poles, Lithuanians, Ruthenians, Jews, Germans, Armenians, Tatars, a land that was, for a time, one of the most extraordinary states in Europe, slowly and then all at once ceased to be. But to tell that story properly, we need a guide, not a king, not an army leader, a witness. In 1788, in a small town in central Poland, a retired priest named Kitowicz sat down at a desk and began to write. He was 60 years old. He had spent his life inside the Polish Commonwealth, attending provincial assemblies, serving parishes, watching the country around him change in ways he found hard to explain and harder to accept. And now, in the quiet of his later years, he decided to write it all down. Not a history, not a political argument, something stranger and more personal. A story of how people dressed and how they ate, how they drank at local assemblies and fell asleep in Parliament, how they argued with each other and prayed and fought duels and buried their dead. He called it a description of customs. And in its opening pages, he explained why he was writing.
Ci, co przed nami żyli 100 lat prędzej.
Those who lived before us 100 years ago were of entirely different customs from ours. Those Poles who come after us in 100 years will surely differ from us who live today as much as we differ from our forebears. He was writing for posterity. He was writing so that the world he had known, its rituals, its absurdities, its particular way of being alive, would not vanish without a record. He finished his manuscript in 1788. 7 years later, the country he was describing formally ceased to exist, and with it, the old Polish ways started to change forever. Kitowicz lived on 9 more years in a land that was no longer called by its old name. He died in 1804. His book was not published in his lifetime. Poland returned to the map in 1918. He never saw it come back. To understand what Kitowicz was mourning and why his country could not save itself, we have to go back to the beginning, to the moment when the land was not dying, but was full of itself and alive and certain it would last forever. Krakow, the Polish capital in the late 1500s, a city of spires and students and dust. Merchants from Dansk haggle with Armenian traders over bolts of silk. A Ruthenian priest walks past a Calvinist printing house, and neither man looks twice. In the square, a minor nobleman, armed as always with the saber he wears like a second limb, is arguing with a magistrate about a property line. He has been arguing about this property line for 3 years. He will argue about it for 3 more. He considers this his sacred right. This is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And to understand what it was, you have to forget almost everything you know about how countries worked in the 16th century. In 1569, in the city of Lublin, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania signed an act of union. The two states had been linked by a personal union since 1386. They shared the same monarch, but governed themselves separately. Now they merged into something more ambitious, a single commonwealth. One parliament, one foreign policy, shared citizenship, and a jointly elected king. Lithuania kept its own army, its own treasury, its own legal system. Poland brought its more developed legal culture, its universities, and its parliamentary tradition. The union was achieved not by conquest, but by decades of negotiation, patiently, stubbornly, one legal clause after the other. The result was the largest state in Europe, nearly 1 million square kilometers, stretching from the Baltic coast in the north to the edge of the Black Sea in the south and east. Within its borders lived Poles, Lithuanians, Ruthenians, Belarusians, Jews, Germans, Armenians, and even Tatars. Dozens of languages, 3 major faiths, a dozen minor ones. It was not an empire in the way Spain or the Ottoman state was an empire. It had no overseas colonial ambitions. It did not think of itself as ruling over subject peoples. It called itself a republic. Rzeczpospolita, the common thing, the shared concern. Even today, the word republic exists as republika in the Polish language, but the country calls itself Rzeczpospolita to underline this old lineage. But back then, at the heart of this republic stood a group of people unlike anything else in Europe. They called themselves in Polish, szlachta, the Polish nobility. They made up roughly 8 to 10% of the entire population. In a Europe where nobles were typically 1 or 2%, this was extraordinary. But what made them truly unusual was not their number. It was their insistence, fierce, unshakable, and jealously enforced, that every nobleman was the legal equal of every other. A petty squire farming a single muddy field in Mazovia had the same vote, the same legal standing, and the same right to speak in the provincial assembly as a magnate who commanded a private army of 10,000 men. This was not a pleasant fiction. It was law, and the szlachta defended it, the way other nations defended their borders, with litigation, with rhetoric, and if necessary, with their sabers. The king in the system was not a sovereign. He was a servant. When a king died, the throne did not pass to his son. It was declared vacant. An election was called, and the electorate was, in theory, the entire szlachta. Candidates even had to campaign for votes. They came from across Europe. French princes, Habsburg archdukes, even Transylvanian warlords, campaigning for votes hundreds of years ago. What a sight. They made promises. They signed a contract, the Pacta Conventa, binding themselves to specific obligations, written limits on their power, and specific penalties for overreach. The king served the Republic. The Republic did not serve the king. Whereas in London, in Madrid, in Paris, monarchs were consolidating absolute power. In Poland, the nobility was building a system designed to make absolute power impossible. And then they did something that no other country in Europe would manage for another half-century. In the year 1573, in the chaos following the death of the last dynastic king, Sigismund Augustus, who left no heir, Polish Parliament, the Sejm, met in Warsaw to decide the future of the state. They passed an act. Its most memorable clause read,
Whereas in our Commonwealth there is no small disagreement in the matter of the Christian faith, and in order to prevent any harmful contention arising from this, as we see clearly taking place in other kingdoms, we swear to each other, in our name and in that of our descendants forever, on our honor, our faith, our love, and our consciences, that although we are dissidents in religion, we will keep the peace between ourselves, and that we will not, for the sake of our various faiths and differences of church, shed blood, confiscate property, deny favor, imprison, or banish.
This was 1573. In France, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in which Catholics slaughtered thousands of Protestants in the streets of Paris, had taken place the previous year. In England, Catholic priests were being hanged, drawn, and quartered. In the Netherlands, hundreds were burning at the stake. Between 1550 and 1650, over 500 people would be legally executed for religious reasons in England alone. In Poland, over the same century, the number we know was about 12. Just 12. The Warsaw Confederation guaranteed the freedom of all Christians, Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, Orthodox, to practice their faith without penalty or discrimination. It was signed into law 75 years before the Peace of Westphalia would attempt the same thing in Western Europe. And unlike Westphalia, it was not a treaty imposed after decades of war. It was a decision made freely by a parliament, because the alternative, religious violence, struck the Polish nobility as beneath them. A Venetian envoy, one of several foreign diplomats who visited the Commonwealth in these decades, writes home in bewildered admiration, he has seen a country where the nobility elects its own king, where Jews trade freely in the public market, where a Calvinist lord and a Catholic bishop sit side by side in the same parliament and argue about tax policy, not theology, where a peasant's son, if educated, can rise to the rank of secretary in the royal chancellery. He cannot quite decide whether this is the most enlightened country in Europe or the most ungovernable. We now know that in this time he was right on both accounts. Meanwhile, beyond the eastern border, beyond the vast plains, the forests, and the steppe grass that stretches to the horizon, the Grand Duchy of Muscovy has not forgotten its ambitions. Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, having failed in 3 wars to break Polish power on the eastern frontier. His successors have not forgotten either. They are watching. To understand what will be lost, we must first understand what Commonwealth was. It was not only the politics, but the texture, the weight and grain of daily life in a country that believed it had solved the fundamental problems of human governance, and for now had no reason to think otherwise. The freedom the Polish noblemen loved most was the freedom to say no. It had always been there, woven into the fabric of how the Polish parliament, Sejm, worked. The principle was simple. Legislation required the consent of all, not the majority, all. If every deputy in the chamber did not agree, the law did not pass. This was not an accident. It was a conviction, deeply held, that laws imposed on an unwilling minority were not laws at all. They were tyranny dressed up in procedural clothes. For most of the 16th century, this principle caused little damage. When a deputy objected, the marshal of the Sejm called a break. Consultations were held in the corridors. Compromises were made. The objection was withdrawn, or the bill was dropped, and the session continued. The system was slow, sometimes maddening, but it worked the way any system works when everyone involved believes it should. However, it stopped working on a Saturday afternoon in the spring of 1652. The Sejm had been sitting for 6 weeks. It was the 4th year of the Cossack rebellion in the east, Bohdan Khmelnytsky's uprising, which had already left large parts of the Ukrainian borderlands in ruins. The deputies were tired. They had voted reluctantly for increased taxes. The agenda was still full of unfinished business, but the marshal rose to announce a prolongation. More days, more debate, more expense. The chamber shifted. Men wanted to go home. And then a voice was heard.
Nie pozwalam.
I do not allow it. The marshal called a break, and the chamber emptied. On Sunday, many deputies packed their things and left Warsaw, assuming the parliament session was all but over, and that the remaining business was ceremonial. By Monday, the marshal learned that a formal statement of veto had been registered with the Crown Secretariat by one Władysław Szyczyński, envoy of Upita in Lithuania. Szyczyński had gone straight from the chamber to the Secretariat, and then taken horse to the east without speaking to anyone. He was gone. The marshal consulted lawyers. He consulted colleagues. There was no precedent for what had happened and no remedy. Szyczyński's veto was legal. It was valid. There were not enough deputies left in Warsaw to form a quorum. The session could not be recalled. Every piece of legislation passed in those 6 weeks. Every tax voted, every bill debated, every resolution agreed upon was declared null and void. Szyczyński had acted on the orders of Janusz Radziwiłł, one of the most powerful magnates in Lithuania. The fee he was paid is said to have been modest. What followed was not a crisis. It was a slow catastrophe, stretched across a century. Of the 55 Sejms convened between 1652 and 1764, 48 were dissolved by the veto. Some lasted only hours. Some were broken on the first day before a single word of debate had been spoken. Deputies were paid to destroy sessions they had been elected to attend. The fee never needed to be large. A veto cost less than a cavalry regiment, and it was much more effective. The magnate families accumulated power that dwarfed the royal treasury. They commanded private armies, they ran private courts, they made their own foreign policy. The Commonwealth was not collapsing from without. It was fragmenting from within, pulled apart by the very men who called themselves its defenders. And abroad, 3 capitals reached the same conclusion independently. Swedish agents, Prussian representatives, and of course Russian diplomats, all understood what the liberum veto meant. It was the most valuable weapon in European diplomacy. It cost almost nothing, It could destroy a parliament from the inside in a single afternoon. And the men who sold their votes, who accepted a modest fee to speak 2 words that annihilated an entire session of government, considered themselves patriots. They were defending liberty. They were guarding the sacred principle that no man could be bound against his will. That principle, in other countries, was called democracy. In Poland, it had become something else. Here, it had become a door, and it was wide open. In July 1655, Carl Gustaf of Sweden crossed the border with 50,000 troops and marched south. Warsaw fell within weeks. Kraków fell shortly after. The king, Jan II Kazimierz, fled across the Carpathian Mountains into Silesia with a handful of courtiers and an empty treasury. Behind him, the greatest magnates of the Commonwealth looked at the advancing Swedish army, looked at their own dysfunctional parliament and their absent king, and did what the system had trained them to do. They calculated their personal advantage. They capitulated. They swore loyalty to the Swedish king. The Poles call what happened next potop, the deluge. In a few years, an estimated third of the country's population died. From war, from plague, from the famine that follows both. Swedish troops sacked cities that had stood for centuries. Churches were stripped, libraries burned. The university in Kraków was looted. The grain stores along the Vistula that had fed half of Northern Europe were emptied or destroyed. A country that had been, 3 years earlier, one of the largest and most prosperous in Europe, was suddenly, shockingly, dying. A Polish nobleman and soldier who had lived through those years, a chronicler named Vespasian Kochowski, set down in writing what the country looked like.
Zewsząd dochodziły smutne
From
wieści
every
o klęskach.
side came sad news of defeats, capitulations, and devastation. Misfortune was reaping a rich harvest. The king was worn down by adversity, and from nowhere did any hopeful news appear. Towns burned. Churches and monasteries went up in flame. Whole districts of Kraków were turned to ash. And then something strange happened. In the south, at the edge of the Silesian highlands, stood a Catholic monastery on a hill called the Bright Mountain in the town of Częstochowa. Inside the monastery was an icon, the Black Madonna, the most revered image in Poland. Around the icon were walls, and behind the walls was a garrison of 160 soldiers and 70 monks. The Swedish army arrived with 2,000 troops. They laid siege. The siege lasted 40 days. The monastery held. 160 soldiers and 70 monks, behind medieval walls, held against a professional army for 40 days. When the Swedes withdrew, exhausted, humiliated, unable to explain to themselves what had happened, the news spread across the country like fire. The Polish king returned from exile and credited the Madonna with saving Poland. He issued the vows of Lviv, declaring the Virgin Mary the queen of the Polish crown. Jasna Góra became the psychological turning point of the war. Polish cavalry, the same cavalry that had watched the magnates capitulate without firing a shot, began to rally. Resistance groups formed in the forests. Farmers armed with scythes and axes attacked Swedish supply lines. The Swedes, overextended across a country too vast to hold, began to retreat. By 1660, the Peace of Oliva ended the war. Poland survived. Among the soldiers who rode through those years was a young nobleman, Jan Chrysostom Pasek. He was a noble cavalryman, boastful, vivid, completely certain that God was on Poland's side. He would later write his memoirs, and they would become one of the most extraordinary documents of the age, not because he was wise or because he understood what had happened to his country, but because he wrote down exactly what he saw. And what he saw tells us more about the Szlachta than 100 political analyses. The years after the Deluge brought no peace. Armies continued to move through the provinces. Civil war broke out in 1666. Lubomirski's rebellion, Poles fighting Poles, and Pasek rode on the royal side. At the battle that followed, he watched the flower of Polish cavalry destroyed in a single afternoon. He had a clear explanation.
God, on account of our discords, let it happen. He took away the flower of our brave cavaliers who had always withstood the onslaughts of the enemy.
Not the veto, not the magnates who had opened the gates to every foreign army for a generation, not a system that had left a country of millions without the ability to defend itself. God's punishment for discord. The remedy, therefore, was not reform. It was atonement. But the same nobleman, on his estate, in a quieter year, caught a peasant poaching rabbits without permission. He ordered the man to eat the rabbit alive. All this while he had a pet otter to which he was very devoted. Poland survived the deluge, but it learned the wrong lesson. The Jasna Gora miracle became the founding myth of a new kind of faith. The conviction that Poland was divinely protected, a bulwark of Christendom, a country watched over by the Virgin Mary herself. The Szlachta repeated this to each other in their manor houses and at their assemblies. God was on their side. The evidence was plain. They had been struck down and they had risen. What they did not ask, what nobody in any assembly or any church or any manor house seems to have asked, was a simpler question. Why were we so catastrophically vulnerable? The veto was not reformed. The magnates kept their armies. The treasury was not restored. The system that had allowed a foreign king to march from the border to Krakow in a matter of weeks. The system that had left a country of millions with no coordinated defense, no standing army, no mechanism to compel the magnates to fight. That system was patched and resumed as if it had not just killed a third of the country. Poland survived the deluge. It survived because of courage and faith and the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people who refused to accept that their country was gone. But it did not learn. It survived the way a man survives a heart attack, and then goes back to the habits that caused it. Because those habits are who he is, and he cannot imagine being anyone else. 100 years from now, the candles will go out in the Polish Parliament chamber for the last time, extinguished by men paid to do so. And they will do it with handkerchiefs, and by then, it will be too late. In 1697, the Polish nobility elected a new king. His name was Augustus. He was the Elector of Saxony, a German prince, Protestant by birth, who had converted to Catholicism specifically to qualify for the Polish throne. Augustus was famous for three things: his extraordinary physical strength, his appetite for women, and his near-total inability to govern the country he now nominally led. Augustus II did not speak Polish. He did not understand the Polish legal system. He did not particularly care about either. He had wanted a crown, and Poland was the only country in Europe that would sell him one, or rather, elect him to one, which amounted to much the same thing once you had paid the right magnates. And while he got his crown, Poland got the Great Northern War. In 1700, Augustus, fighting not as King of Poland, but as Elector of Saxony, dragged the Commonwealth into a war between Sweden and Russia. Poland had no part in this conflict. It had no treaty obligations, no strategic interest, no army mobilized. But its fields lay between the two belligerents, and neither Sweden nor Russia saw any reason to go around. For 21 years, the Great Northern War rolled back and forth across Polish territory. Swedish, Russian, and Saxon armies battled on Polish soil. Hundreds of thousands of Polish civilians died in a war that was not theirs, fought on their land, through their towns, across their harvests, while their parliament could not meet long enough to mount a response. And then something happened that was not a battle, not a siege, not an invasion, but that was, in its quiet way, more devastating than any of them. In 1717, Augustus II, with Russian military backing, convened a special session of the Sejm. The Russian ambassador, Grigory Dolgorukov, sat in the chamber. His soldiers stood outside. No deputy was permitted to speak. Not one word, not one objection, not one "I do not allow it." The session ratified constitutional changes in complete silence. Deputies sat with their mouths closed, while their parliament, the institution they had built their entire political identity around, was reshaped by a foreign ambassador and a puppet king. This was called the mute Sejm. Mute is not a metaphor, not a figure of speech. It is the literal description of what happened in that room. The Russian troops that had entered Poland for the war did not leave Warsaw after the peace was signed. They were still there when Augustus II died in 1733. They were still there when his son, Augustus III, inherited the throne. And under Augustus III, in a reign that lasted 30 years, every single Sejm that was attempted was dissolved by the veto. 13 sessions convened. 13 sessions collapsed. Not one piece of legislation was passed. Not one tax was voted. Not one reform was enacted. For 30 years, the largest country in Central Europe was effectively ungoverned. It was into this world that Jędrzej Kitowicz was born in 1728. He was not a magnate. He was not a politician. He was a minor nobleman, the same class of man we met before, proud and loud and armed with a saber, who grew up watching the slow-motion theater of parliamentary self-destruction, and decided, with the dry precision of a man who had seen too much to be angry, to write it all down. This is where his voice begins in this story, and what he describes is both very funny and very frightening.
Do zerwania Sejmu.
To dissolve the assembly, you did not need a man of reason or of public spirit. Any deputy, dark as night, who had been put into his seat at the local assembly for this very purpose, would rise in the chamber and say, "There is no agreement for this parliament." And that was sufficient. When the marshal asked, "What is your reason?" he answered simply, "I am a deputy." I do not permit it. And having said this, sat down like a dumb devil, answering all pleas and demands with nothing more than those same words. I am a deputy. The parliament had become a theater of the absurd, and Kitowicz, sitting in the spectators' gallery, recorded it with the eye of a man watching a country dismantle itself in real time. Spectators in the galleries threw hard pears and apples at the heads of deputies who spoke badly. A deputy, struck on his freshly shaved scalp, would rise to protest, showing the marshal the fresh lump on his forehead as evidence. The marshal would say, "Find the one who hit you, and you will see him punished." Nobody could ever find the thrower. The pear throwing continued. Servants opened bottles of English beer that sprayed across the chamber, soaking deputies mid-speech. Nobody could tell whether the spray was accidental or deliberate. It did not matter. The speech was interrupted either way. And at the local assemblies, nobles drank wine mixed with spirits until they passed out at the table, under the fence, in the middle of the street, in the gutter, in the mud, wherever their staggering legs carried them and dropped them. And this they called the old Polish manner. But Kitowicz's most extraordinary passage is not about dysfunction. It is about sabotage, about the moment when the system did not fail by accident, but was destroyed on purpose in plain sight by men who understood exactly what they were doing. It happened in 1746. For once, for the first and only time in 30 years, both factions in the Sejm had agreed to let a session run to completion. Legislation had been drafted. The army was to be expanded to 60,000 men. The bills had been debated, amended, and agreed upon. All that remained was to read the final text aloud and sign it. The speeches ran long. Private petitions were raised. Hours passed, it grew dark, and then the marshal, overjoyed at the hope of a happy conclusion, called for candles to be brought. But these, and the torches brought several times after, were each time extinguished at the chamber door, with handkerchiefs, with caps, with bare hands, by men placed there for that purpose, to great shouting that it was not proper to hold a Sejm by candlelight. The marshal sat with the deputies in darkness until 10 o'clock, trying after each extinguishing to bring in another light. Finally, seeing that this was not the mischief of servants, as he had first believed, but a deliberate scheme to destroy the Sejm, he dismissed and dissolved the chamber, ending a long and deeply felt speech with these words: "And as for the one who caused this, stet diabolus ad dextris eius, let the devil stand at his right hand." Kitowicz wrote it all down. The deputy who answered every question with gestum possu. The candles extinguished by men with handkerchiefs. The pears thrown at bald heads. The beer spraying across the chamber. The nobles in the gutter sleeping off the local Sejmik in the mud. He wrote it because he knew the world he was describing would not be believed unless someone recorded it. He wrote with the precision of a man compiling evidence for a trial that might never take place. And beneath the irony, beneath the absurdity of men destroying their own parliament while shouting about freedom, there is something else in his prose. A quiet, careful grief for a country that cannot stop itself. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg in 1762, a 34-year-old German-born woman deposed her husband in a palace coup and took power as Empress of Russia. Catherine II, Catherine the Great, had very clear ideas about Poland. She had watched this country, this vast, paralyzed, magnificent, ridiculous country, fail to pass a single law in 30 years. She had watched its magnates sell their votes to foreign ambassadors. She had watched its parliament dissolve itself, session after session, while Russian troops stood in its capital and Russian diplomats sat in its chamber. She did not see Poland's weakness as a problem to be solved. She saw it as a resource to be managed. If a country cannot manage its own life, it will be managed by someone else. In 1764, a man named Stanisław August Poniatowski was elected King of Poland. He was intelligent. He was cultured. He spoke 5 languages. He loved French philosophy, Italian painting, and the idea of Poland. He was also Catherine the Great's former lover, and she had put him on the throne. He knew this. He understood from the first day of his reign the nature of the trap he was in. He owed his crown to the very power that was strangling his country. Every reform he attempted would be measured by St. Petersburg. Every success would be a provocation. Every step toward independence would risk the army that had placed him where he sat. He began reforming anyway. Schools were open. A military academy, the Szkoła Rycerska, the night school, trained a new generation of officers. The Monitor, Poland's first regular newspaper, published Enlightenment ideas and political criticism. In 1773, the Commission of National Education was created, one of the first secular state education systems in Europe, established before the French Revolution, before the American public school system, before almost anything of its kind anywhere in the world. Poland was trying to save itself. And then, in 1772, while those reforms were still gaining momentum, Russia, Prussia, and Austria simply took what they wanted. No war was declared, no battle was fought. 3 empires drew lines on a map, and Poland lost 30% of its territory and 35% of its population. Russian troops surrounded the parliament chamber, the same chamber where Sitkinsky had spoken, where deputies had sat like dumb devils, where candles had been extinguished by men with handkerchiefs, and deputies were ordered to ratify their own dismemberment. Some wept. Some refused to sign and were removed and replaced with men who would. The ratification passed. But the reformers did not give up. Through the 1780s, working around foreign interference, around the veto, around the magnates, around the Russian ambassador who sat in Warsaw as if he owned it, they drafted what they intended to be Poland's salvation. On the morning of May the 3rd, 1791, the deputies who supported the reform returned to Warsaw early from the Easter recess. Their opponents were still away, at their country estates, at their churches, on holiday. This was not an accident. The reformers had planned it. They had one chance, and they took it. A bill, secretly prepared, was read to a half-empty house. The king was persuaded to sign. The vote was rushed through before opponents could arrive and speak the 2 words that would have killed it. It abolished the liberum veto. It created a hereditary monarchy. It extended rights to townspeople. It placed the peasantry, for the first time in the history of the Commonwealth, under the protection of the law. Outside the royal castle, in the square, people wept. Women threw flowers from windows. Soldiers and citizens embraced and shouted, "Vivat Constituția!" Long live the Constitution. It was the first written modern constitution in Europe, the second in the world after the United States. For one morning, in one square, in one city, in Warsaw on May the 3rd, 1791, Poland had saved itself. It lasted 14 months. In the winter of 1791, a group of Polish magnates traveled to St. Petersburg. They met with Catherine. They synchronized their plans, and on the 27th of April, 1792, they signed an act of confederation designed to overthrow the Polish constitution. For the sake of good form, they concealed the act's existence until they had time to make their way back to Polish territory, to a small town in Ukraine called Targowica. There, on the 14th of May, they raised their standard. 4 days later, a Russian army joined them. They called the Constitution a Jacobin conspiracy, an attack on Polish liberty, a threat to the ancient freedoms of the nobility. They invited Catherine the Great to send her armies into Poland to restore the old order, the veto, the golden freedom, the sacred right of every nobleman to say, "I do not allow," and bring the state to its knees. Catherine was happy to oblige. The Russian army crossed the border. Poniatowski's troops fought, and for a brief moment it seemed that Poland might hold. But the king, facing a threefold numerical advantage and watching his Prussian allies betray him and join the Russian side, lost heart. In August 1792, almost without warning, he announced his adherence to the Confederation of Targowica. He ordered his troops to hold their fire. The Constitution was annulled. Piotr Skarga had stood in the same chamber in 1597, 195 years before this moment, and told the nobility exactly this, that their love of freedom would become the instrument of their own destruction, that men would invoke liberty to destroy the state that protected it, that they would call themselves defenders of the Republic while handing it to its enemies. The men of Targowica were not fools. They were not villains in the simple sense. They were magnates who had grown up inside a system that told them, for 200 years, that their personal liberty was the highest value in the political universe, higher than efficiency, higher than order, higher than the survival of the state itself. They believed that their interests and their country's survival were the same thing. They were wrong. And by the time they understood how wrong they were, it was too late. The second partition followed in 1793. Poland lost another half of its remaining territory. The Sejm at Grodno, the last Sejm in the history of the Republic, was forced to ratify it under the sights of Russian guns. And then, one final time, Poland fought back. In March 1794, Tadeusz Kościuszko, a military engineer who had served with Washington and Lafayette in the American War of Independence, who had built fortifications at Saratoga and West Point, who had come home to a country that could not afford to pay him, stood in the market square of Krakow and swore an oath.
I, Tadeusz Kościuszko, swear before God and to the whole Polish nation that I shall employ the authority vested in me for the integrity of the frontiers, for gaining national self-rule, and for the foundation of general liberty, and not for private benefit.
The uprising that followed was extraordinary. At the Battle of Racławice in April 1794, peasants armed with scythes charged Russian artillery positions and took them. Farmers against trained soldiers. Agricultural tools against cannon. They won the battle. It was the last brilliant moment. They won the battle. They lost the war. In November 1794, the Russian army under Suvorov appeared on the east bank of the Vistula, across from Warsaw. The suburb of Praga was stormed. Colonel William Gardner, the British minister, one of the last foreign diplomats still in Warsaw, crossed the river to see what had happened. He wrote to the British Secretary of State,
"It is with regret I inform your lordship that the day of the forcing of the lines of Praga was attended by the most horrid and unnecessary barbarities. Houses burnt, women massacred, infants at the breast pierced with the pikes of Cossacks. The scenes I beheld made me shudder."
On the 25th of November, 1795, Stanisław August Poniatowski, the last king of Poland, abdicated in exile in Grodno, surrounded by Russian dragoons. A counselor of the Russian mission informed the remaining ambassadors that their posts had ceased to exist since the court to which they were accredited had ceased to exist. The final Treaty of Partition, signed in St. Petersburg in January 1797, contained a secret article. The three powers agreed to suppress the name of Poland, not to defeat it, not to occupy it, but to erase it. The name and designation of the Kingdom of Poland, the treaty read, shall remain suppressed as from the present and forever. The ambassadors left Warsaw one by one. The papal nuncio was the last to go. The armorials of St. Peter hanging on the gates of the nunciature were the final public acknowledgement that a state had existed here. When his carriage turned the corner of the street, the police took the arms down and placed them in a museum. After November 1795, thousands left. Soldiers who went to France and were later absorbed into the revolutionary armies. Families who went east, who went south, who went wherever they could. Men and women who had supported the uprising, who had carried messages, kept accounts, sheltered the wounded, and who now had no country to stay in. Some years later, the sentiment that they all felt was described by the great Polish poet in the exile, Adam Mickiewicz. His famous work, Pan Thaddeus, begins like this.
Lithuania, my country, thou art like health. How much thou shouldst be prized, only he can learn who has lost thee. Today thy beauty in all its splendor I see and describe, for I yearn for thee, Holy Virgin, who protectest bright Częstochowa and shinest above the Ostrogate in Wilno, thou who dost shelter the castle of Nowogrodek with its faithful folk, as by miracle thou didst restore me to health in my childhood, when, offered by my weeping mother to thy protection, I raised my dead eyelids and could straightway walk to the threshold of thy shrine to thank God for the life returned me. So by miracle thou wilt return us to the bosom of our country. Meanwhile bear my grief-stricken soul to those wooded hills, to those green meadows stretched far and wide along the blue Niemen, to those fields painted with various grain, gilded with wheat, silvered with rye, where grows the amber mustard, the buckwheat white as snow, where the clover glows with a maiden's blush, where all is girdled as with a ribbon by a strip of green turf, on which here and there rest quiet pear trees.
Today, the crypt at Wawel is still there. Casimir the Great still lies in his tomb. Jagiełło beside the pillar. Sobieski in his coffin of black marble. Their coats of arms still hang from the walls. Their swords still rest on velvet cushions. Polish flags still fly from the castle above them. Their country vanished for 123 years. Their tombs did not. In January 1797, 3 empires signed a treaty agreeing to suppress the name of Poland from the present and forever. The language was banned from schools. The institutions were dismantled. The Sejm was dissolved. The army was disbanded. Every public trace of the Republic was erased, filed away, placed in a museum, struck from the record. They did not succeed. The name survived in places where treaties could not reach, in books that people hid, in songs they sang quietly when the authorities were not listening, in manuscripts passed from hand to hand, written in a language that was not supposed to exist. The memory of the old republic, its freedoms, its failures, its particular way of being alive, refused to disappear. Poland returned to the map in 1918, and the restored republic chose as its national holiday the 3rd of May, the date of a constitution that had lasted 14 months. In a small town in central Poland, in the last years of the old Commonwealth, a retired priest named Jędrzej Kitowicz sat at his desk and wrote down everything he could remember. He had spent his life inside a country that was coming apart. He had watched the Sejms fail, watched deputies rise and speak 2 words and bring the parliament to nothing. He had seen men extinguish candles in the chamber with handkerchiefs and leave the deputies sitting in darkness. He had seen the drinking of deputies, the pears thrown at shaved heads, the country dissolving around him year by year, veto by veto. He wrote it all down, not as a historian, not as a politician. He did it for us, as a witness. He described how people dressed and how they ate, how they drank at local assemblies and fell asleep in Parliament, how they argued with each other and prayed and fought duels and buried their dead. He finished his manuscript in 1788. He could not have known that within 7 years, the country he was describing would cease to exist. That the name he wrote at the top of his pages would be erased from official documents, that his book would not be published in his lifetime. He died in 1804. He never saw Poland come back, but his words came back. In his preface, he had written,
Ci, co przed nami żyli
"Those who
100
lived
lat
before
prędzej,
us 100 years ago were of entirely different customs from ours. Those Poles who come after us in 100 years will surely differ from us who live today as much as we differ from our forebears." He was writing about customs, about how people dressed and drank and argued in Parliament. He was also, without knowing it, writing about the end of this world. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you liked this story and want to hear more of what makes us, subscribe.